Okay, guys, just so you know, this is the video presentation for Lecture 18, Game Consoles in the 128-bit era. So we started off talking about the Sega Dreamcast right before spring break and how that was sort of the last console for Sega. And today we're going to talk about the PlayStation 2, the Xbox, and the GameCube. They'll be separate videos, so they're a little bit shorter and easier to get through. And we're going to start with Sony's PlayStation 2. So Sony's PlayStation 2 was the is the best-selling video game console of all time. It sold over 150 million consoles, almost a billion pieces of software, almost 10 games per console on average. It is the high watermark of game consoles up to this point. It was designed to be backwards compatible with original PlayStation, which was a big feature because prior game consoles, when you got a Super Nintendo or a Sega Saturn, it was not compatible with the Nintendo or the Sega Genesis. So the ability of the PlayStation 2 to play your complete library of PlayStation 1 games was really, really popular with parents and families. It could also play DVD and CD-based games as well as DVD movies. This is a really important point because at the time, DVD players by themselves cost about $250 and a PlayStation 2 cost $300. So for the price of a little bit more than a standalone DVD player, you also got a cutting-edge game system. And Sony will remain the industry leader just like they were in the 32-bit era with PlayStation. As I said before, Sony shipped 150 million plus consoles. Xbox is estimated to be around 22 million. GameCube around 19 billion. 1 billion pieces of software. 7,100 software titles shipped. 1,200 people or companies making games for them around the world, and market share just over half the market. Um, Keep in mind that Sony runs a 10-year time cycle, or excuse me, a 10-year life cycle for their video game consoles. So even though they released the PS2 in 2000, they were still supporting PS1 up until 2005. So there is a little bit of lag there, which explains why they have so many more sales overall than the other two game consoles. Both Xbox and Nintendo GameCube quickly came out with successors, while Sony continued to support the PlayStation 2 until about 2010 officially. So that plays a big role in their success. The PlayStation 2 itself is a pretty slim console. It was a little bit higher. It was more expensive than Dreamcast, but it did play DVD, which was a big strategy with conversion. Again, I talked about this in the first slide. This idea that for the price of a little bit more than a DVD player or a little bit more than a Dreamcast, you were also getting a device that could play these new digital discs that had movies on them, replacing VHS tapes. The original PlayStation model had USB capabilities, it had firewire ports, which is again a proprietary Sony format or a firewire port, excuse me, was a old video format that not many things used, but it was available. Lots of accessories. It had a web camera, it had an optional hard drive, an optional network adapter for internet play, but those weren't standard. But it had the ability, it was a very flexible system. It did have a kind of unique technical architecture. They called it the Emotion Engine that made it kind of hard to develop for. So it was kind of a pain to develop for PlayStation 2. Sony continued sharing tools and tips and tricks just like they had with the PlayStation 1, but it was a little bit more hassle for developers. Game development was also getting more expensive at this point because of this. And so as a result, it still had widespread support, but game developers would have liked a little more standardization. The biggest piece of the PlayStation 2 is understanding that they envision this in a couple different ways. One is by using the DVD player aspect of the console is to be sort of a Trojan horse to get you to buy into a game console. If you're already a gamer, getting a DVD is a bonus. But if you're not a gamer and you bought this to primarily play DVDs, you also got a game console that would further sort of entrench you in sort of Sony's ecosystem of media and buying DVDs from their movie studios. It could play CDs from their music studios. Um, it could also play PlayStation 2 and PlayStation 1 games. So it would let you live a Sony branded digital lifestyle. This is a really critical piece that sometimes gets overlooked is because Sony envision this as part of your living room setup. It's part of your media, part of your digital lifestyle. So when we talk about that, this idea of the digital living room, what was going on around 2000 and the first half of the 21st century, entertainment was transitioned from analog to digital. We gave up VHS tapes to go to DVDs because the quality was better, they were smaller. Video games became much more popular, very mainstream in this era. So they were sort of displacing board and card games to a certain extent. Um, and Sony and Microsoft both wanted to be the central thing in your living room that all this digital entertainment got distributed through. This is a little bit pre-broadband and pre-smartphone, so most people don't have Wi-Fi in their houses yet. It's really you might have more than a dial-up, you might have broadband if you live in a big city, but the idea here is that both Sony and Microsoft want to be the hub for all your digital entertainment. From Sony's perspective, because of the huge success of the original PlayStation, they envisioned that their game console, the PlayStation 2, would be this thing that all your entertainment ran through, whether it was music, movies, video games, anything like that. You still bought everything on physical media. There's no digital downloads yet. So Sony envisioned by being that box next that was attached to your TV in your nice living room, that you would in fact route all your entertainment through them and they would make more money that way. Microsoft initially pushed a PC centric version. This is the idea behind Windows Home Theater PC, Windows Media Efforts, because both Sony and Microsoft realized that whatever device you plug into your big TV in your house or your main viewing screen or whatever you want to call it is going to be the thing that determines where the revenue goes, right? Every time you buy something to put in your PlayStation, Sony makes money. Every time you buy something to load up on your home theater PC, Microsoft gets paid. So there's a real sort of uh, acknowledgement that whatever box or PC or console, whatever it is that you attach to your big TV, is going to be a big driver of revenue down the road. You got to bear in mind too that this again predates HD or high definition video. That doesn't become really standardized broadcast until 2005. So this is still in that transition period when we're going from an analog world to a completely digital world. But both Sony and Microsoft recognize that being that box next to the TV is critical for their success down the road. Basically, and as far as games go, it's Sony's strategy is very similar to what they do with the PS1. They rely fairly heavily on third parties to provide the key titles for their systems. A lot of these are sequels to games we already saw that were big hits on PlayStation. Things like Metal Gear Solid, Gran Turismo, Final Fantasy all had new titles on the PS2. Grand Theft Auto is a special case. It is the biggest game of this era by far. It's the biggest game franchise. There's Grand Theft Auto 3, Vice City, San Andreas. We're going to talk about those in a separate lecture individually. But Grand Theft Auto first appears on the PlayStation, and as a result, again, it just feeds on itself, right? It's the most popular game franchise on the most popular console, so it's a big success all around. We'll be looking at some of these games on the Twitch stream, and those videos will also be recorded. And if I get a chance, I'll try to move them to YouTube and make them as accessible as possible. Sony also lost several new franchises in the PS2, and some of these were Sony first-party games. God of War is from Sony. Jak and Daxter was made by Naughty Dog, who had made the original Crash Bandicoot games. I can't remember if at that point they were a first-party studio or not, but Sony eventually bought them and created a first-party studio with them. Guitar Hero from Activision is a good example of a peripheral-based games, and this was a sort of specific genre that these kind of games became very popular in this era. And let's talk about those for a second. Peripherals are unique controllers or accessories necessary to play a particular game. So we had all these before, right? We had steering wheels and arcade sticks for arcade style games, but during this era it became really varied. So you had a lot of things like, I'm going to hold some up to the webcam and let's hope we can all see them. So here's a microphone for a karaoke game that you could karaoke revolution for Konami, so you could sing Britney Spears in your house. I did that some. Taiko drumming, if you want to do Japanese style drumming game. This was a translation of a Japanese arcade game. Webcam, the iToy webcam, had a certain set of games for it. And of course, little plastic guitars so you could emulate all your favorite rock songs in Guitar Hero. So these were really everywhere. The Sega had some, the GameCube has them with the Donkey Konga. There's quite a bit of choice there, but these become available and sort of widespread in this era. But they're most prevalent on the PlayStation 2. And that's really because the PlayStation 2 has the largest install base, right? When you sell 100 million game consoles, when you sell to 1% of that group, you sell a million of whatever you're selling, little plastic guitars, microphones, Japanese taiko drum toys. That large install base makes that possible. The other thing I'd like you to see here, if you think about this, is that there's sort of a link here to the idea of casual gaming. Keep in mind that a PlayStation 2 controller has 4 face buttons, 4 trigger buttons, 2 analog sticks, a select to start, and a home button, and a D-pad on top of all that. So these games were starting to get very complex in terms of their control mechanics, which is great if you're a gamer, right? More control equals more immersion equals more choice for game design. But for people who just want to like, who maybe grew up playing arcade games where just a joystick and a button, this is starting to get a little bit much, right? Or people don't have a lot of time to master games. So these ideas that you could just simply, take the controls for the drum game, for example, or is the drum and 2 sticks. I didn't get those out that you hit it with. That's all you got to do to be able to play that game. The webcam game is like a dancing style game where you just mimic the motions you see on the screen. Um, Guitar Hero, admittedly, is a little bit more complicated, but even that is just push one button at a time, usually, or maybe two, and mimic a guitar, which again, a lot of people are familiar with in the real world. So a lot of these peripheral based games take advantage of the idea that you don't have to have a lot of muscle memory or be able to quickly sort of acclimate to a complex control scheme in a game. So this is sort of the inklings of see some connections here to what we call casual gaming today. All right, and then the PlayStation 2, much like the PlayStation 1, where we saw the parappa the wrapper, because again the install base is simply so large, you get these sort of cult or niche games. So things like Ico, which has sort of this very dreamy action adventure game, Rez, which is this rail shooter inspired by this Russian painter in style, and it was an arcade cabinet I think originally, but it's a music rhythm game where you fly through these environments like it's a rail shooter and you try to trigger things in time to the music. And again, that's not going to appeal to a wide audience, but because you have 100 million people who own your game console, you sell to 2%, you sold 2 million copies, this sort of stuff is very viable. This also leads to things like Katamari Damacy, which roughly translates as treasure clump, from the Japanese, and it's this game where you roll up everything in the world into a giant ball. And I'll demo a lot of these on the stream, or you can look at YouTube videos of them if you want to see what they look like. Again, these kind of games sort of exist in two spaces: one, because of the large install base, and two, because there's a million copies of Madden and Jack and Daxter and God of War. So these niche or cult games sort of exist in contrast to that. It's very similar to like what they call indie film to a Hollywood movie, right? We're going to all run out and go see the next Avengers movie, but then there might be this little small movie like Parasite from South Korea that's a foreign movie, but sorry, bad example, but a small indie movie that we all sort of like flock to, like Little Miss Sunshine or something like that. So there's some examples of some cult and niche games on the PS2. So reviewing the PS2, it builds on the success of the PlayStation. It remains an industry leader. Strong third-party support continues. A lot of the same franchises. We get some new ones. The huge success leads to all these peripherals. You can have cult games. Now, the one thing about the PlayStation 2 that's a little different is that it was designed to be a very flexible system. So it had a hard drive you could buy. It had a network adapter for internet gameplay, but these were not standardized, and only certain games took advantage of them. So this was not as successful. This is in contrast to Microsoft Xbox because of their background with PC. They're going to in fact make their game console have these things as standard, and we'll see how those different approaches play out in terms of functionality and in some ways driving their success. So that's it for the PlayStation 2. If you have any questions, please email me or contact me or drop by virtual office hours, and I will get this video uploaded as part of a playlist with the Xbox and GameCube. Hope everybody's doing okay. Please take good care of yourselves, and I'll get the next video going.